Okay, let's dive right into this. When I used to think about the history of resistance in India against British rule, my mind would literally just jump straight to one monumental year, 1857, right? We tend to picture it as this sudden, massive explosion of defiance that just seemingly came out of nowhere. But looking at the actual data, it turns out we almost always skip over an entire century of hidden, simmering resistance. So today, in this explainer, we're going to look closely at this massive century of defiance that actually laid the very groundwork for that Great Rebellion.
So we really have to ask ourselves, was the 1857 rebellion actually a surprise? It's such a fascinating question. And the reality is, no, that famous uprising wasn't some spontaneous eruption at all. Instead, it was the explosive boiling point of a 100-year pressure cooker. It's just incredible to realize that long before the sepoys mutinied, thousands of ordinary people, dispossessed rulers, and tribal leaders were already out there waging localized wars against colonial expansion. To really put that into perspective, we have to start way back around 1757, moving right into the era of the Battle of Buxar and the absolutely devastating Bengal famine of 1770. Then we see massive, massive events pop up, like the Pica Rebellion in 1817 and the Santal Rebellion in 1855, which was literally just 2 years before the Great Rebellion of 1857. I mean, look at that massive 100-year gap. This entire period wasn't quiet, it was packed with active anti-colonial resistance that actively simmered, setting the stage for exactly what was to come.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to unpack the century before 1857, rulers and civil resistance, the tribal uprisings, peasants and faith movements, why early revolts failed, and finally, the road to 1857.
Starting off with part 1, the century before 1857, our 100-year pressure cooker.
Moving right along to part 2, rulers and civil resistance, where dispossessed leaders fight back.
Now, the key thing to really wrap your head around for this entire century is that this was way before the concept of modern nationalism even existed. Early resistance was highly localized, it was spontaneous, and it was led by traditional figures. Kings, chiefs, local leaders. They weren't trying to build a brand new nation state. They were just dispossessed leaders fighting back fiercely against the sudden loss of their autonomy. Just imagine being a local leader and suddenly a massive foreign corporation steps in and tells you your centuries-old hereditary title is totally obsolete. Well, that is exactly what happened to the Polygars down in Tamil Nadu, who were traditional military chiefs, and the Paikas over in Odisha, who were hereditary military landholders. Traditional leaders like Veerapandiya Kattabomman and Bakshi Jagabandhu didn't just roll over and accept their fate. When their territories got annexed, they organized formidable armed struggles to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. And hey, it definitely wasn't just men leading the charge here. In the 1824 Kittur revolts in Karnataka, the charge was actually spearheaded by Rani Chennamma. Decades before the British fully weaponized the notorious doctrine of lapse, they flat out refused to recognize her adopted heir. They basically used a bureaucratic loophole to steal her kingdom. Her incredible pioneering role as a woman leading an early armed resistance against British administrative overreach is just an absolutely critical chapter in this century of defiance.
Now, when we start connecting the dots across all these different civil rebellions, it's a massive aha moment. From Tamil Nadu to Odisha to Karnataka, they were all facing identical grievances. Literally the same issues. They were dealing with brutally increased land revenue demands, they were losing their traditional hereditary rights, their territories were being aggressively annexed, and many were just getting crushed by the financial and military burdens of the subsidiary alliance system. So, despite being completely geographically separated from one another, their core antagonists and political frustrations were exactly the same. Let's shift gears a bit to part 3, the tribal uprisings, defending the forests and lands. For communities like the Paharia, the Bhil, the Kol, and the Kond, their deep, centuries-old connections to their environment were suddenly and violently threatened by colonial expansion. The absolute most striking example of this is the massive Santal Rebellion of 1855 to 1856. This was the largest tribal uprising before 1857, period. Up in the Damini Kol region, which is present-day Jharkhand and Bihar, the Murmu brothers, Sidhu, Kanhu, Chand, and Bahirath, they rallied their people into a massive, highly organized revolt. It's just an incredibly compelling story of a community deciding that they had finally had enough, taking up arms just a single year before the Great Rebellion. And this brilliantly illustrates how the breaking points for these communities weren't just abstract political ideas, they were existential. We're looking at the total alienation and loss of their traditional lands to outsiders. We're talking about strict British controls completely cutting them off from the forests they literally relied on for survival. Add to that the ruthless exploitation by outside moneylenders, plus the oppressive revenue policies of the zamindars, and you leave these communities with absolutely no option but armed pushback. They were literally fighting for their very survival.
Moving into part 4, peasants and faith movements, where economic distress meets religious fervor. Here is where we explore a truly powerful fusion: intense economic distress colliding with religious fervor. Heavily taxed peasants and traditionally revered ascetics actually began banding together. A perfect example of this is the Sannyasi Fakir rebellion in Bengal, which spanned from 1763 all the way to 1800. Right after the Battle of Buxar, and following the absolutely horrific, devastating Bengal famine of 1770, the British decided to impose strict restrictions on the traditional movements and pilgrimages of Hindu and Muslim ascetics. Well, when you combine that severe interference with the crushing taxation placed on the local peasantry, you trigger a massive, decades-long uprising, led by figures like the fakir leader Majnu Shah. Over in eastern India, we also see these socio-religious movements channeling some deep economic and anti-colonial anxieties. Take the Wahhabi movement, founded by Syed Ahmad Barelvi. This focused intensely on religious reform, but combined it with violent, armed resistance against foreign rule. On the flip side, you have the Farisi movement, founded by Haji Shariatullah, which similarly emphasized religious reform but directed its fierce opposition primarily toward the crushing economic exploitation by zamindars. Both of these movements really show how local economic and political frustrations found an incredibly powerful organizing voice through the lens of faith and reform. Which brings us to part 5, why early revolts failed, an autopsy of a fractured resistance. Okay, so we have to ask the difficult, somewhat tragic question: why did these incredibly brave, century-long rebellions ultimately collapse against British forces? Let's do a quick autopsy on this fractured resistance. Step 1, there was just a complete lack of unity. A revolt in Odisha wasn't communicating with a revolt in Karnataka, right? Step 2, there was an absence of an all-India national consciousness. They were fighting for their local regions and their own ways of life, not for an overarching idea of a unified India. Step 3, this extreme isolation meant a severe lack of coordination and centralized leadership. And finally, Step 4, when it actually came down to combat, they were facing advanced British military logistics, superior communication, and modern weaponry, while armed mostly with traditional, militarily inferior weapons. So the crucial point is, without unity and modern weapons, individually, these fragmented groups simply could not win. Finally, let's move to part 6 and see how this builds to the road to 1857, the inevitable explosion. Because, you see, these failures were definitely not the end of the story. When we map it all out side by side, we hit this massive aha moment. The exact same grievances that fueled a century of localized revolts literally became the unified fuel for 1857. Think about it. The loss of privileges and political annexation that triggered the Pikas and Polygars, that is a core cause of 1857. The succession disputes that caused the Kittur Revolt, that maps directly to the outrage over the doctrine of lapse in 1857. The economic exploitation that drove the Santhals, the anti-foreign sentiment of the Wahhabi movement, all of these isolated, seemingly separate grievances from the past century finally converged. 1857 wasn't some sudden, unpredictable storm. It was the inevitable collision of all these separate, swirling weather systems. Which leaves us with this really powerful summarizing thought. The revolts before 1857 were localized and lacked national character, yet they reflected deep-rooted resentment against colonial rule. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative question to consider today. How did 100 years of fragmented, localized, and seemingly failed rebellions ultimately service the essential, blood-soaked foundation that would eventually birth the entire Indian national movement? It's a profound reminder that in history, no act of defiance is ever truly lost.